How did an anti-government protest turn into a full-blown war? How did the world powers get sucked into a small West Asian country's politics? What is in it for the regional rivals? Our next report tells you the story about how Syria lost its last decade.
15th of March, 2011. Syrians first responded to a social media call to demonstrate against the Bashar al-Assad regime. 3 days later, 4 demonstrators were killed. Hundreds of rebel groups, ranging from secular to criminal gangs and moderate Islamists to brutal extremists, began emerging both for and against the government. Amid all this, the Free Syrian Army was formed, a civilian armed group which stood against Assad's dictatorship. In 2012, world leaders met in Geneva for the first time, addressing what was unfolding in Syria. They agreed on the need for a political challenge, but failed to act on it. What they didn't know was that this defeat was going to foil a decade of UN-sponsored peace efforts. United States took cognizance in 2013. On being asked what would push Obama to intervene, the Nobel Peace Prize winner said, "The red line," referring to the use of chemical weapons. Soon reports poured in. Syrian army had allegedly used chemical weapons on a densely populated rebel-held area, eastern Ghouta. 1,400 civilians died, a claim that Bashar al-Assad vehemently denies.
So if the Syrian army wanted to use those kind of weapons, why don't he use it against the terrorists who's been in the field, not against the civilians? So all this story doesn't have, let's say, legs to stand on. It's not realistic, it's not logical. So who's behind it? It was simply the United States and the Western intelligence with the terrorists. They staged this play just to have pretext to attack Syria.
The United States stayed mute. Less than 6 months later, an al-Qaeda splinter group seized the city of Raqqa, Islamic State of Syria and Iraq. The group took advantage of the regional chaos and declared the territory across the border of the two nations as caliphate. Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria being the two strongholds. At this point, the United States decided to intervene. The US military built an anti-Islamic State coalition along with 50 other NATO countries. The Obama administration called for the end of the Assad regime in Syria, yet only devoted enough resources to prevent the rebels from winning. The US was put in a difficult position with an ally, Turkey. The Obama administration was fighting Kurdish fighters, but the Kurds are financed by the Kurdish Workers' Party fighting in Turkey for almost 3 decades now. For Ankara, groups like ISIS are a fundamental security issue, but the Kurds are an existential one. By 2015, the Syrian army lost grounds in many of its towns and cities. But the late of 2015 saw a U-turn in the course of the civil war. Iran and Russia joined the war on Assad's side. Vladimir Putin deployed warplanes, provided military aid, and swiftly turned the course of conflict against the rebels. Then, year after year, Assad's military, backed by the Russians, regained control. Siege, bombardment, and death of thousands of civilians brought back the biggest urban base of Aleppo in December 2016. For Syria's all-weather allies like Iran and Lebanon's Hezbollah, it's a regional necessity to stand by Assad. But what's in it for Russia? Moscow aims to secure its military influence in the region by keeping Assad in power. Putin's involvement in Syria is creating pressure on the West, especially on the United States. Russia has become an unavoidable geopolitical mediator in West Asia. One can't deny that Russia has brought the much-needed stability in Syria. 2017 also saw the downfall of Islamic State. ISIS was fighting a multi-front war against almost every state in the region simultaneously. United States-backed Kurdish-led forces defeated Islamic State in Raqqa, a stronghold of the terror group. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump kept puzzling allies by reversing major political decisions of previous administrations. Trump wasn't seen as a match for Vladimir Putin in terms of experience, domestic popularity, and influence. Trump declared that the United States defeated ISIS in Syria at a premature stage, leaving US. The gradual disappearance of ISIS and al-Qaeda-controlled groups enabled the regime to recover and take power into their hands again. In April 2018, after months of air raids, the Russian-backed army recaptured eastern Ghouta and then took over the city where the civil war started, Dara. Next was the last rebel-held city, Idlib. A glimmer of hope for civilians. On March 5th, Russia and Idlib, vowing to hold joint patrols and establish a secure corridor.
The ceasefire deal will be effective starting from 12:01 as of midnight. In terms of making it lasting, all necessary actions will be taken fast and efficiently. Our goal is to prevent the worsening of the humanitarian crisis in the region. We will work together to supply aid for all the Syrians in need without any precondition and discrimination.
Russian-led offensive in northwest Syria led to the worst humanitarian crisis since the conflict began. The Syrians who took to the streets 10 years ago, demanding Assad to step down, are seeking a normal life now. After a decade of war, Assad's forces are back in control of more than 60% of the country, with the US and Turkish-led groups settled towards the north. So what is haunting some of the Syrians is a question. Was it all worth it? West Asia Bureau, WION. World is One.
We will continue with our stories about the Syrian civil war, but first, as usual, let's take a look at what else is making headlines across West Asia.
The first batch of COVAX-supplied vaccines have arrived for Palestinians. This is a boost to inoculations in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, lagging far behind Israel's campaign. The 38,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine will be used for inoculations, while 24,000 doses of AstraZeneca vaccine will be stored. Iran has released images of its new Revolutionary Guards base armed with cruise and ballistic missiles. State TV reports described the base as a missile city and showed rows of what looked like missiles in a depot with cement walls. No details have been given on its location yet. Israel is set to go to polls next week for the fourth time in 2 years, with Prime Minister Netanyahu facing a re-election battle. The anti-corruption trial and former allies joining rival parties means that Bibi's long run could be in danger. But the world's fastest vaccination campaign could end up being his saving grace. The United Nations mediator Martin Griffiths has told the Security Council that the war in Yemen is back in full force. Having attempted to get the warring parties to talk, the UN also warned that Yemen is spiraling towards a massive famine. Lebanon's President Michael Aoun has asked Prime Minister-designate Saad Hariri to either step down or form a government as soon as possible to tackle the country's economic woes. This comes as Lebanon's financial meltdown has hit the country's food supplies, posing a threat to its stability.
How can we talk about a nation without talking about its people? The Syrian refugee crisis is the world's largest humanitarian crisis since World War II. Millions of Syrians have been displaced within their country, and thousands fled to neighboring countries where they continue to live in camps. It is a never-ending crisis for the Syrians, one that the world has turned a blind eye towards.
Remember this viral image? This is the picture of Syrian toddler Alan Kurdi. In 2015, his body washed ashore in Turkey. The family had drowned their inflatable boat at the bottom of the Aegean Sea. The picture has since become a symbol of the refugee crisis and the hardships that Syrians endure to reach Europe. While the civil war started with thousands on the streets, it ended up with millions on the move. As the violence escalated, families began to flee. Within the first 2 months, the refugee camps opened in Turkey, from Lebanon to Jordan. Syria's neighbors felt the brunt of the mass exodus. Here are some numbers that highlight only a part of the crisis. Over 12 million Syrians displaced from their homes. More than 6.6 million have been forced to flee the country. Another 6.7 million Syrians remain internally displaced, with many living in refugee camps across Syria. Their existence is even more precarious. I traveled to some of these camps. A glimpse into the lives of those living in the camps shows lack of aid, precarious conditions, and an uncertain future. For those who escaped to neighboring countries, the situation isn't any better. Resources are scarce. Camps and settlements are becoming overcrowded. Many are being forced to sleep outside in freezing temperatures.
The Syrian tragedy will go down as one of the darkest chapters in recent history. The Syrian people are among the greatest victims of this century.
Over 60% of Syrian refugees live in poverty, but many of them do not want to return to Syria. If violence wasn't enough, the coronavirus pandemic has further escalated the crisis. People continue to live in overcrowded refugee camps, where social distancing is not an option. There is limited access to food and medicines.
I really do worry about them. But what can you do? That's our life. It's been reduced to a camp. Those still in Syria are in a camp, and we are here in a camp. In Syria, they are waiting for their box of aid, and here we are waiting for our box of aid.
While the world has been a witness to the damage of the war, there is a huge amount of damage that is almost invisible. The mental trauma of millions of Syrians. Over 75% of Syrian refugees battle mental health problems, ranging from post-traumatic stress disorder to depression.
I was really depressed. Sometimes my brother and his wife used to take me out in the wheelchair. They would take me and the kids to the park in the neighborhood. But then my depression worsened. I started getting panic attacks. I would stay for 2 or 3 days completely silent, unable to talk to anyone.
Despite the sky-high rates of PTSD, accessing professional medical help remains difficult. For millions of Syrian refugees, the war may end, but the trauma may not. West Asia Bureau, WION. World is one.
After 10 years, the fighting continues in Syria, and over the years there have been countless peace talks. All of them have failed. Millions are starving, and the pandemic has further battered the economy. So the main question is there an end in sight for this war?
The year was 2011. Bashar al-Assad's government was on the verge of collapse. The Syrian regime looked like another domino, ready to fall into the whirlwind of the revolution. But 10 years later, Assad is still ruling Syria. a Pyrrhic victor of a war-torn nation. The decade-long war has decimated the economy. Hundreds of thousands have been killed. Half of the pre-war population remains displaced. It's been a tragedy of global proportions. The world watched it unfold in real time, only to shift its focus away. 10 years on, the situation is no better.
10 years ago, the violent suppression of peaceful popular demonstrations in Syria set the country on the path to a horrific war. After a decade of conflict, in the middle of a global pandemic, and faced with a steady stream of new crises, Syria has fallen off the front page. And yet, the situation remains a living nightmare.
With the help of Russia and Iran, Assad has all but crushed the insurgency. But he now faces a far more daunting problem: building a nation from the rubble. New cities are being built. People are taking flights to Syria. Western countries offer tours of the nation. And vloggers are being invited. All an attempt to paint a rosy picture. But in the back alleys of Damascus, the reality is very different. Tightening US sanctions means that Syria's economic woes are worsening every day. Purchasing power has collapsed along with the Syrian pound. While banks in Lebanon were once a safe haven amid war, the banking crisis has frozen Syrian depositors out of their accounts. A surge in COVID-19 infections has further exacerbated this crisis.
It's still not too late to act, but the problem is we have to admit that we are being subjected to a severe spike. If we do not like the word of the third wave, just say we have the same coronavirus but with a different spike.
For many, the memories of the 2011 protests are fresh. They were met with deadly force. Another uprising against him looks unlikely. But protesters descended on the streets of Idlib to mark a decade of destruction and despair.
We have come to ask and assure the international community and the whole world that we will adhere to our revolutionary principles until our last breath.
Many believe that the Syrian war is a thing of the past, that the Assad regime has emerged victorious, but this victory may have come at a cost. One that the country could take years to recover from. For yet others, the Syrian war is still raging. The army continues to push back the rebels. From the skies, bombs still drop, and Syrians flee. The question remains, is this the war without an end? West Asia Bureau, WION, World is One.
That's all we have for you on this episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, bringing you more stories from the world's most volatile region. Until then, stay home and stay safe. I am Ghadi Francis, and you are watching WION, World is One.